So, let me begin today's lecture. I will begin the concept of division of labor, Ricardo model. Let me see. And by quoting from numerical example in my Korean textbook, International Trade Theory, which we used at Seoul National University so many years, over 20 years. Okay. Is this chapter 2? Am I sharing this? Yeah, chapter 2, right? Okay. Okay, so the numerical example I drafted here is a little bit different from the one that we used in our last class lecture. But the numerical example that I'm quoting from my Korean textbook on international trade is simpler and easier to understand. So let me repeat the division of labor and comparative advantage concept spelled out by David Ricardo as an exercise. Of course, we have covered this concept with different numerical example, but the new numerical example I put it in here is will give you another opportunity to take a chance of exercising. Okay. So suppose the numerical example, new numerical example is given. England and Portugal. World is consisting of two nations. So England plus Portugal together makes world. Suppose there are two industries, only two commodities, clothing and wine. And in England, it takes 100 persons to produce 1 unit of clothing. In Portugal, only 80 persons is required. So the concept here, 1 unit divided by 100. In other words, 1 unit divided by 100 means per person, they are producing in England 1/100th much clothing, right? On the other hand, Portugal, 1 person is producing 1 divided by 80 much. 1/80th unit is produced in Portugal by 1 person. So the number, unit divided by number of persons, we define labor productivity. So per person, how much they produce. For example, suppose instead of 1 unit, suppose there is a 100 unit is produced by 100 persons in England. Then, of course, per person labor productivity is 1 person producing 1 unit. Okay. How about Portugal? Instead of 1 unit, suppose 100 units were produced by 80 persons. Then per person, 100 divided by 80. So 125 much unit Portugal per person is producing. So what I'm trying to show you is that per person labor productivity is higher in Portugal than England. So in that case, we say, we define Portugal has absolute advantage in producing clothing over England. Okay. How about in wine production? Wine production, for example, let me see. Oh, I'm repeating the same numerical example that we visited. Okay, so let me see if I can remount numerical example. Okay, 왜 그걸 열었는지 모르겠는데 제가 그러면 저기로 들어가려고 그러면 어떻게 돼? 다시 열어야 되니까 일단 나가야 되냐? 회의 나가게 그 파일을 찾아야 되는데 지금 다른 파일이 나왔어.
지금 제가 올린 파일이 있습니다.
응?
이 파일을 보셔도 돼요.
화면 공유 여기
지금 제가 올린 파일이 있어서
자네가 올린 파일이 있어.
채팅 눌러보시면
채팅을 누르면
이 파일도 이게 지금
아.
신문이라서
이거요? 어디 어느 이거? 아니
지금 저장하는 중.
저장하는 중에 오케이. 그럼 올라왔어? 올라와 이거요?
네.
그럼 이렇게 하면 공유가 되나?
네, 다시 화면 공유 주세요.
어? 다시 화면 공유해야지.
네.
화면 공유가 지금 안 되지. 화면 공유가 안 되잖아.
주문 눌러보시죠.
지금 누르면. 이건 화면 공유.
여기서 다시.
아니 이 화면이 아니라니까. 이 뉴머리컬 example이 이게 아니라고. 오케이. 그냥 내 노트북으로 들어가. 여기로 들어가. 오케이.
아까 저걸 옛날 걸 끄시고 지금 켜져 있는 거 하시는 거 같아요.
어? Left class revised final. 이걸 차라리 열어야 돼. 이게 뉴머리컬 example이 뭐가 나와? 이거 아닌데. 내가 뉴머리컬 example 바꿨거든.
지금 열려 있습니다.
응?
맞으시죠?
맞다. Okay. Sorry about it. We were in between two files, and I'm sharing with you the new file. Okay. Probably this file was probably will have to be resent by TA An during my course of presentation. So please, if you receive this new file, please open this new file, okay? Mr. An, during my lecture, you can send it. Okay, right, okay. Again, let me apologize that the numerical example that I'm looking and sharing with you is from my old international trade textbook, as quoted here on slide number 4 from Pyo 1993 International Trade Textbook in Korean. Okay, according to this numerical example of this textbook, similar numerical example, but the numbers are different. England, to produce 1 unit, 100 persons. Portugal, to produce 1 unit, clothing, 90 persons. It's like 2 by 2 matrix. For England, wine, 120 persons. Portugal, wine, only 80 persons. So as I said, if you divide this 1 unit of clothing by 100 persons, in England, per person, 1 divided by 100 much clothing is produced. That is, we define England's labor productivity of clothing industry. In case of Portugal, 1 unit is produced by less number of people, 90 people. So 1 person produces 1 divided by 90th much clothing. So Portugal's labor productivity of clothing is higher than England's labor productivity. In that case, we say Portugal possesses higher labor productivity. And also, Portugal has absolute advantage because we are not comparing yet clothing versus wine. Yet absolute advantage in producing clothing over England. In other words, Portugal requires less number of people. So Portugal's per person labor productivity is higher than England, okay? World total, of course, 2 units of clothing, assuming England has only 100 persons, Portugal has 90 persons. So 2 persons, 100 plus 90 persons mobilized, world total production is 2 units of clothing. How about wine? The same. You can see 120 persons required for England to produce 1 unit of wine. Portugal, 80 persons to produce 1 unit of wine. So in even wine production, Portugal's per capita productivity, labor productivity, per person labor productivity is higher than wine. So in this case, you can check, you can see Portugal has absolute advantage over England in both producing clothing and wine. Producing both clothing and wine, Portugal has absolute advantage. Then probably the world should have 2 units of clothing, 2 units of wine. By having Portugal has comparative advantage. Okay. But this is kind of autarky, no trade situation. But what happened if 2 countries engage in free trade based on comparative advantage, complete specialization? What does that mean, complete specialization? Compared to no trade case, incomplete specialization. We call incomplete specialization. England and Portugal produce two goods, both clothing 1 unit, wine 1 unit. Portugal producing 1 unit of clothing, 1 unit of wine, and no trade is engaged between two nations. World trade, world welfare remains at 2 units level of clothing, 2 units of wine. That's it. This is incomplete specialization, which means England produces both goods. Portugal produces both goods. Okay, so producing two goods, both goods, we call incomplete specialization. What happened? If two countries listening to Ricardo's message and engage in complete specialization based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. What is the meaning of comparative advantage? Okay, comparative advantage means for England to produce 1 unit of clothing, 100 persons is required. But to produce wine, 120 persons are required. 100 divided by 120 can be regarded as opportunity cost of producing clothing. How about Portugal? 90 persons is required to produce clothing. Only 80 persons is required to wine. So Portugal's opportunity cost of producing clothing is higher than opportunity cost of producing England clothing. Opportunity cost for England is 100 divided by 120, but Portugal 90 over 80. So we say that England possesses comparative advantage in clothing. Portugal, on the other hand, has comparative advantage in wine production. So Ricardo's message, let both countries specialize completely in the production of comparative advantage they have. So in England, they put the resource, 100 persons, 120 persons in two industries together, move to the clothing industry, 220 persons. Of course, then they will produce 2.2 units of clothing because they require 100 persons to produce 1 unit. On the other hand, Portugal should put all the people, 170 people, to producing wine. So this situation we call complete specialization. That is, only one production is made, one commodity is produced. So 170 persons divided by Portugal has 80 persons per unit, 1 unit. Therefore, 170 divided by 80 gives you 2.125 units. So first of all, let's see world trade, world welfare. World welfare becomes higher than under no trade, incomplete specialization, 2 units. Now it becomes 2.2 units of clothing, 2.125 units of wine. So we can say that world welfare has increased from no trade situation to comparative advantage-based free trade situation. Okay, so assume terms of trade in international trade. That means price of clothing with respect to price of wine. International price is let us suppose this is 1-to-1, 1-to-1. Of course, if you carefully examine this assumption 1-to-1 is not falling out of heaven. It is deliberately chosen assumption because opportunity cost of producing clothing in England is 100 divided by 120. Portugal, 90 divided by 80. So 1-to-1 assumption is made such that it can be bracketed between two international prices. Left-hand side, 100 divided by 120 could be regarded before trade price of clothing in England. 90 divided by 80 could be regarded as before trade clothing price in Portugal. As you can see, clothing price, relative price with respect to wine price was higher in Portugal than in England. Therefore, England is said to have possessed comparative advantage in producing clothing and Portugal in producing wine. Okay, so then we can also argue that how about each country's welfare? Okay, in slide on 5, England is producing 220 persons, 2.2 units of clothing, and Portugal is producing 2.125 units. Therefore, both England and Portugal's welfare has increased compared to this previous slide on page 4. England produced 1 unit, 1 unit. Portugal produced 1 unit, 1 unit. But if now England produces 2.2 units and Portugal produces 2.125 units, and if they can trade 1-to-1, England welfare has increased from 2.2 units of clothing and wine, 2.2 units of clothing. Portugal from 2 units of clothing and wine to 2.125 units of wine. So if you also carefully examine between welfare, comparative comparison between welfare of England and Portugal, who gains more? England has extra 0.2 units of clothing. Portugal has extra 0.125 units. If they trade 1-to-1, then England relatively welfare jump is higher than Portugal. Now, isn't it paradoxical? We started this example showing that England is disadvantageous. In other words, England was inferior country compared to Portugal. You see, Portugal had absolute advantage in clothing and wine. But if they listen to comparative advantage concept advanced by Ricardo and engage in complete specialization based on comparative advantage and engage in free trade, then what happens is extra gain in trade is higher in England than in Portugal, which is kind of paradoxical. If two countries engage in trade, usually the inferior country, by which I mean the advantage, comparative advantage is lower. Absolute advantage is lower country. That lower absolute advantage possessing country gains more. It's paradoxical. For example, Soviet Union is England, and non-Soviet Union, all European, Asian country, Soviet Union's, partner country is Portugal, for example. Then we have a two by two matrix. Now, Soviet Union could be absolute disadvantageous nation vis-a-vis compared to non-Soviet Union, all other countries. But if two words, Soviet Union and non-Soviet Union country, engage in free trade based on complete specialization, let's say Soviet Union is more advantageous in producing equipments and some scientific, military goods or some whatever tools and so forth. The rest, mostly non-equipment goods or something like the non-scientific goods. Then what happens is the gain accrued to Soviet Union will be larger than Portugal, the rest of the Soviet Union countries, other trading partners. So this is a very simple message, but very powerful message. Seemingly disadvantageous and less advantageous, less comparative, less absolute advantageous countries could gain more if they are engaged in with comparative advantage nations in free trade world. Okay. So, for example, this is the assumption that suppose previously this green line, green letters, England 1 unit, wine 1 unit, Portugal 1 unit, 1 unit. This 2 by 2 matrix in green letter is under autarky, no trade, no comparative advantage based trade. So, but if they engage in complete specialization and engage in free trade, England can have 2.2 units of clothing. Portugal has 2.125 wine. And if Portugal has 1 unit leave their country, 1 unit of wine, the rest 1.125, 1-to-1 ratio, give it to England, right? Or 1.125, give it, please keep that in clothing. Then England deducting 2.2 units from 1.125 units, 1.075 clothing will be left over. And wine-wise, because Portugal has given 1.125 units of clothing to, for example, England, so Portugal has 1.125 units of wine. So the word together, these 1.1075 England's clothing, Portugal's clothing together, 2.2 units of clothing. Wine 1.125 plus 1, 2.125. So these red numbers is after trade matrix. These green color numbers are before trade matrix. What is the gains from trade? World total gains from trade in clothing, 0.2 units much. Gains from trade from wine, 0.125 extra units. So world welfare has increased substantially. How about Portugal? Portugal has 2.125 units of clothing and wine. England has 2.2 units. So again, England has a higher payoff metrics, in other words, return from free trade. So number one country, England, who has absolute disadvantage, gains more, which is a paradox, I claim. Okay. So this is a comparative advantage conclusion. And this is somewhat more extra discussion. For example, before trade price under autarky should be, for example, price of England in clothing should be 100 persons is required to produce 1 unit of clothing. So wage rate times 100 should be PC. In England, PW should be wage rate times 120. Wine price should be much higher than clothing price. Portugal, similarly, PC star is Portugal's pre-trade price of clothing. W star, Portugal's wage rate times 90. PW star is Portugal's wine price before trade, W star times 80. So relative price of clothing in England before trade under autarky is PC divided by PW is W. And 100 divided by W120, 100 divided by 120. Relative price of clothing in Portugal before trade under autarky, you compare PC star, PW star, W star 90 divided by W star 980. Then 90 divided by 80. Please note, relative price of clothing in England before trade is lower than relative price of clothing in Portugal before trade, which is 90 over 80. That's why relative clothing lower country, England, has comparative advantage in producing clothing rather than wine. Note, relative price of clothing before trade under autarky is cheaper in England than in Portugal, which means England possesses comparative advantage in clothing. Note that after trade international relative price must fall between 100 divided by 120, 90 divided by 80. So, for example, if after trade international price is, as we assumed, 1-to-1, that should be bracketed. Higher end by 90 divided by 80, lower end divided by 100 divided by 120. Okay, so this is more logical explanation of this numerical example. And you can take a look at my textbook version of diagram, but these are all extra. For example, these diagrams can be combined together to show you so-called word transformation curve, which is learner's diagram. And this is a home country. So 100 divided by 120, foreign country, 90 divided by 80. So if we combine these England's production possibility curve with Portugal's production possibility curve, we come up with learner's diagram. And learner's diagram, suppose there is kind of world welfare maximizing, let's say, let me see if I can draw it here. Let me see if I can draw somewhere. Can I show you? 여기다 드로잉 하려면 뭐 편집을 해야 될 텐데 그게 편집이 되네. 합의도를 편집을 하고.
요 위에 있는 거.
응? 위에 나오는데 위에가 안 나오죠. 여기 위에 있을 것 같은데. Okay, I will just try to explain. So world welfare curve could be nonlinear curve like this. Okay, I cannot draw it, but maybe revised version, my TA An can draw welfare. 주석 달기? No. 이거 확인해?
네,
Right. Okay. Sangwa, thank you very much. I'm trying to draw sort of nonlinear welfare curve. You see, this welfare curve is maximized at Ricardo point, this R, B. You see, any point other than that, A point or C point, cannot maximize world welfare. So Ricardo point can truly maximize world welfare. What is Ricardo point? Home country, England, specializing only clothing production. What is the meaning of B point? Foreign countries complete specializing on food. Food can be regarded as wine. Clothing can be regarded as clothing. So therefore, this point B is truly Ricardo point, welfare maximizing point. This welfare maximizing point can only achieved by home country England specializing clothing production and by foreign country Portugal producing wine production. Okay, point B. Okay, so that's kind of a division of trade, trade story. Okay. So, can you go back? Can we go back? 새로운 녹음은 끝내고. Okay, so I hope this supplement very important concept of division of labor and comparative advantage with a new numerical example. Okay. So we move to the previous page 35. Am I correct?
지워야 될 것 같습니다.
Okay. Never mind. It does not help. You can revise that, okay, after the class. Take care of the deletion, okay? So now we are continuing from the previous presentation of chapter 2, Korea after 1945, okay? A typical classic example of the divergence of Western type economic and political development happened in Korean Peninsula after 1945. As you may know, Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. from 1910 to 1945. So only after Japan defeated Second World War II in 1945, Korea became independent nation after 1945, gained liberation, independence. Okay, but again, through the Yalta Agreement, Korean Peninsula was divided into two parts: North Korea around 1946, 1946 to 1947, Republic of Korea, South Korea. And the North Korea region was originally occupied by Soviet Union troops. South Korean division was occupied by US military troops. So both the winners of World War II, instead of defeaters of World War II, Japan, occupied temporarily Korean Peninsula. And as a consequence, Korea became divided between North Korea and South Korea. But in addition, Korea's development, particularly South Korea's development, was an example of divergence of Western type economic progress, economic growth, but under the political development, which is a very authoritarian regime. So the divergence, the keyword, Western type economic sphere, Western type economic segments is quite somewhat different from political development, which is not Western type. It's a very authoritarian regime. That's divergence, the word divergence. In 1945, as I said, liberation and US military government in South Korea. Republic of Korea. And the division of North Korea and South Korea. North Korea was more heavy industries oriented. South Korea was more agriculture based. Korean War 1950-1953 broke out. A quarter of wealth in South Korea. Is estimated to have been destroyed through Korean War. Very devastating. And the loss of over 1 million lives. And there is always debate. North Korea invaded South Korea, backed up by China and Soviet Union. But on the North Korean side, they dispute. It was originated by South Korean declaration of independence and intrusion into the border for the 38-degree line. At any rate, the internal war, Korean War, between North Korea and South Korea, North Korea backed by Soviet Union and China. On the other hand, South Korean backed by US military troops, was made truce 1953. From 1953 to 1962, South Korean economy kept alive by US military and economic assistance. So in this case, I should say, not North Korea, South Korean economy. Okay. So the regime called Lee regime and the Park regime, Lee regime from, let's say, from roughly 1947 1948 through 1960. Park regime is roughly from 1962 to 79, roughly, at the time of this publication. So what was the consequence of liberation from Japan? About 70,000 Japanese administrators left in 1945, 1946. So that means there is a huge vacancy in administrative staffs. In other words, government function was almost stopped by the complete departure of Japanese administrators. After 36 years of colonial rule, Korea was in vacuum in terms of administration. Tri-Power Conference in Cairo, as I said, has allowed a trusteeship for Korea. A trusteeship means it's kind of UN resolution that is the country, newborn country, like in South America or in Africa, they feel that the country cannot be run by itself, by the people they have. That means it's like infant country. Therefore, these tri-power conference in Cairo, who participated? Tri-power conference, US, England, and the Soviet Union. So from England, Churchill, Soviet Union, Stalin, and the US, President Roosevelt, attended this conference. And they agreed upon trusteeship for Korea, assuming that Korea cannot be run by itself. Someone has to take care of a newborn baby, like infant country. But this was vehemently opposed by Korean people, both South Koreans and North Koreans. They felt that they are ignored, and both South Korean residents and North Korean residents vehemently denied trusteeship. So the consequence, general election was held in South Korea on May 10, 1948. And probably DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, it's North Korea. North Korean government was established. So the story below is only for South Korea. South Korea from 1963 to 1976 under Park regime has made a record increase in government in GDP per capita. GDP increased at about 10% a year, high growth period. under Park regime. U.S. assistance phased out in 1945. So the rapid growth, the social and economic modernization, well, underway. However, political development, not much progress, moves in opposite direction. Park regime became authoritarian. Dictatorship. Okay, so this is so after that, we can see some picture. The Ri regime was born and the Park regime was born. This is tripartite Yalta Agreement. Chiang Kai-shek, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill at the Cairo conference, but later at Yalta conference, Chiang Kai-shek was replaced by Stalin. Okay, so this tripartite conference was held in 1943, and this is, for example, Ri regime and Park regime. First, a diplomatic relationship was restored after 1945 in 1965. It's kind of monumental agreement between Korea and Japan. For example, Ri regime and the Park regime, we call Miracle on the Han River 70 years later. For example, it starts from 1964 under President Park. And for example, Hyundai Motor Company founded, and democratic reforms, Roh-tae elected president. This is the period so-called quasi-authoritarian regime, becoming South Korea becoming less dictatorship-oriented country, more sort of a democratic society, and ultimately Asian financial crisis, 1997, hit Korean economy. So first time GDP fell down. After that, global financial crisis, 2017, around brief recession in Korean economy. This is a kind of brief 70 years history of Miracle on the Han River chart. Of course, we will in detail take a look at in detail what is the story. Korean War, communist institutions and practices gone because of Korean War. Armed forces as the strongest organization in South Korea. Because of war, South Korea was left with the armed forces, which became very strong social power. Ri versus Cho Bong-am, Progressive Party, but this Cho Bong-am, Progressive Party leader, somewhat socialist-oriented candidate, was arrested and executed in 1958 which shows very authoritarian regime under Reed regime. In 1960 election, Liberal Party versus well-organized Democratic Party, and they claim election was stolen, but at any rate, Liberal Party has won, which led to April 19 student revolt. Reed resigns president on April 27, followed by one-year democracy from July 29 election with Changmyon premier, but with Democratic Party's failure to control vandalism, thuggery, and crimes. May 1961, small military group led coup by President Park, who led a very small group of 250 officers, has won the coup d'etat. And we can define Lee-Seung-man regime from 1948 to 1960 as a kind of personal authoritarian regime. What does that mean? This authoritarian regime was run by personal dignity or personal kind of dictatorship, personal influence. On the other hand, Park regime was more organized, bureaucratic, authoritarian regime. So we can compare Wee regime and Park regime. Park regime, of course, 1962, 1979. So bureaucratic regime. So this is Korea under authoritarian regime. Riot police tried to disperse demonstration protesting election rigging during the April 19 students' uprising of 1960s, which ultimately led to 1961 coup d'etat staged by Park regime, Park and his associates. Okay, this is President Park standing here after a military coup. Korea under authoritarian regime, military council chairman Park Chung-hee and KCIA director Kim Jong-pil with some 30 colonels and brigadier generals. Economic growth, no organized opposition, but very little popular support. This needs a little bit of explanation. Under Lee dynasty, so-called, there were two classes in ruling class. One class is so-called literate class. In Korean, we call 문반. 문 means literacy. So 문반 always was superior to military class. Military plus police class. This is so-called 무반. Korean. So this dominance of military, literate class always commanded social respect. So when there was an organized opposition and the military coup was staged by then Korean military groups, including President Park Chung-hee, general mass, public, did not pay any respect to militarily organized group. In other words, the winner of coup d'etat. They did not give them respect, social respect. So, how could they legitimize the new government? Okay, we had to mobilize military forces to grasp power. How to justify? So they felt that because economic condition was so bad, they can only legitimize their new government if and only if they can achieve economic growth. In other words, economic growth was the only kind of avenue. Economic growth was the only kind of avenue for them to escape. Okay, so this should be economic growth should be first target to make their military coup d'etat legitimized. So Democratic Republican Party was formed in 1963, President Park winning an assembly election in 1963 and controlling the assembly power too. And first 5-year plan was launched with the stabilization programs of 1963 and 1966, dictated by U.S. government as a condition for release of U.S. assistance. Joint U.S. Korean Economic Cooperation Committee was formed. So with the help of U.S. administration, Korea became stabilized Korean economy and started to pay attention to first 5-year economic development plan. Okay. So normalization of relation with Japan in late 1965. Japanese reparations of $500 million and the inflow of private investments and technology from Japan accelerated economic growth already set in motion. So the Korean bureaucracy deserves high marks. Civilian mixed with retired army officials composing of Korean bureaucracy try to protect the country, try to accelerate the country's economic conditions. Similar patterns can be observed in many developing countries, but results of this structure often vary. Successful examples in Korea, Brazil, Taiwan, wants and needs of developing states are all different. So not only successful examples, there could have been failures. Government is expected to accomplish more. Decisions regarding the use of resources and distribution of income was always government's concern. While Western governments also increased their participation with a move towards social welfare, they did not have the issue of resource allocation, had enough time to implement a functioning system with checks and balances. So Korea under authoritarian regime, another reason explaining this difference is that certain structural changes are hard to implement in a democratic environment. For example, normalization of relations with Japan. Quadrupled the gasoline price overnight in 1973. Normally, in many developing nations, including Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, there was a large-scale demonstration because overnight price increase of oil crisis has made the price of oil quadruple. But in case of Korea, they were under authoritarian regime, putting down all demonstrations by semi-military government, no riots, and could maneuver economic development against this 1973 oil crisis. The influence of military is large, bureaucracy, 60,000 people from every village and 200,000 a year returning discharge, and 2 million people men aged between 18 and 40 in militia. So economic development with option political stability of a disciplined society could be managed because of this military recruiting system. After 1965, a unique relationship between government and business through EPB, Economic Planning Board, elite authoritarian rule began. So Korea under authoritarian regime, 1967 presidential election, as I said, Park and Yoon Po-sun. Construction first and distribution later was Park's slogan. Yoon Po-sun, opposition party leader, more equitable distribution of income, a greater emphasis on social welfare, but landslide victory for Park. DLP, a ruling party, gained more seats in assembly. So the 1962 constitution limited president term as 2 terms. But in 1975, President Park changed his mind to increase 2 terms limitation. He conducted plebiscite. Plebiscite means national, voting event. So by national voting event, they changed 3 terms of presidentship, and Park promised if elected in 1970, he would step down in 1975. But tragedy of President Park, he didn't keep this promise. Even 1975, he tried to postpone and he tried to lengthen his presidentship beyond 1975. And we call that as Meiji Restoration type of dictatorship under President Park. Opposition leader Tae Jung-kim carried the Seoul in voting, but lost. Park wins 45% with 80% participated, a very narrow margin, which is the signal of opposition strengthening after 1975. So that is in 1972, Park regime proposed a new Yushin, revitalizing reforms, leaving president's term at his discretion. It's like the new constitution got 91% at a popular referendum. And this began as a tragedy of President Park. And ultimately, developments in Vietnam influenced American support, political stability, and economic growth followed. But February 1975, plebiscites designed to reform the legitimacy of his government, 80% voted and supported by 73.3% of those voting, 25% negative, 20% did not vote, substantial opposition in the cities, universities, other intellectual communities. And against President Park, the momentum mounted. So Korea under authoritarian regime, political developments in Korea have not moved in the direction of modernization, institutions, values, and structure of the West. This is the evaluation by authors. Mason et al. Are evaluating Korea under authoritarian regime. government has had a pervasive influence on the use of economic resources, the distribution of income, but the failure of democracy in Korea, even though the democratic political aspirations continue to exist. And this was the evaluation by American authors of this textbook. And conclusion is modernization in the third world has not led in the direction of political democracy, and Korea is no exception. 1950 invasion from the North Korea and the possibility of renewed invasion, always sufficient justification for the fifth largest standing army. So Japan and United States was sources of education, but as Korea develops, the divergence between political development and current of social change will become pronounced. So authoritarian regime in Korea differs from other LDC, less developed countries. Economic growth as a national objective in Korea. Not only national income increase since 1963, remarkable, but also all elements of population have shared this prosperity. The governing elite considered political stability to be essential to economic growth, repression of political opposition necessary. So Mason et al. This textbook, since this was first written, dramatic events have overtaken in Korea. The assassination of President Park by the head of Korean CIA on October 26, 1979. Western friends see an opportunity for the establishment of fundamentally democratic state from fundamentally non-democratic state, fundamentally dictatorship-oriented state. They have seen the assassination of President Park as a chance, as an opportunity for establishment of fundamentally democratic state. The best can be hoped for a regime less repressive and far more decentralized, and then into ultimately full democracy, pleasing democracy. We call this is happened in 1963. The birth of so-called 문민정부. 문민정부 means a civilian democracy. Under present. So this concludes. But given the continuing threat from the North, any signs of indecisions and weakness by a more democratic regime would elicit a demand for strong direction. Only if the posture of North changes due to internal development or external pressures, it seems likely that democratization can be pursued in a more permissive and secure environment. But as of now, as you can see, North Korea did not change, strengthening military power and nuclear power. Therefore, the tension in Korean Peninsula is ever mounting. That's the kind of preliminary conclusion. Okay. Let me stop here, maybe about 5 minutes to change our slides into chapter 3. Okay. You can have a 5-minute break. 챕터 3가 여기 올라가 있냐? 어?
하나 올라왔어.
지금 올려갔어? 찾아봐. 아, 네가 챕터로 메시지를 올렸구나.
다운로드.
다운로드하고. 올라오면 공유를 떠야 되는 거 아니니? 아직 안 떴나?
누르시면 돼요.
화면 공유? 아, 이거 뜨면? 떴지. 그지? 다시 화면 공유로 들어가야 되나? 오케이. Okay, now let us turn to chapter 3. We do not have much time left over, but still we want to begin chapter 3 coverage. Chapter 3 is about historical foundations of economic growth, kind of larger historical base and foundations for the Korea's development. Three basic parts to Korea's historical foundations. The first part is long time of independence as a single unified state, homogeneous independent state over 100, 200 years. One language, one race, and one single culture. Korea was unified by its own Silla dynasty in the 7th century, different from countries formed by colonial powers. Nigeria, India, Indonesia, Spanish, Portuguese colonialization, East Asian heritage, Confucianism, emphasis on education was kind of characteristics of Silla dynasty through Lee dynasty, Korea's independence. Advantage of Hangul, Korean language, on literacy rates, and peasant farmers achieving very high yields per unit of arable acreage, supporting aristocracy of landlords and officials, and creating commercial supply networks. By 1910, Korea was formally annexed to Japanese Empire until 1945, end of the Second World War. Most Koreans suffered real deprivation under Japanese rule, but profound changes, including the Japanese mode of bureaucratic control of the economy, followed. So February 1945, causal Yalta agreement, Soviet and American troops divide the acceptance of the surrender of Japanese troops. At the 38th parallel, the division of the nation into two parts, North Korea and South Korea, as I said before. Okay, so a key feature of modern economic growth is a rise in per capita income. Now, always this is very important understanding. A key feature of modern economic growth, the best indicator is a rise in per capita income. Okay. The traditional or backward or pre-modern society was dominant in East Asia, but Tokugawa Japan, 1600-1868, political unification was made and rapid rise in commercial urbanization, levels of literacy, and agricultural productivity. So Tokugawa Japan first moved on to political unification and rapid urbanization and rapid modernization. Pre-modern China in 1,000 years ago, several over a million cities and 1/3 of adult males were literate, and over hundreds of thousands with over 20-year formal education and tutoring. See, for example, table 31. So 14th, 19th century population increased by sixfold, were fed by grain output increase, see table 3.2. Japan in late 19th century, China after 1949, universal primary education was adopted. Look at this. Japan around 1890. China after 50 or 60 years later, only universal primary education was adopted. Technical training for the operation of modern industry and control their domestic commerce in comparison with Southeast Asia and Africa. Government institutions and political affairs grounded on their political realities. So Korea was a part of greater East Asian experience, but with significant changes. So the economic and social structure of traditional Korea, briefly, 13th century, the Mongol invasion was made. 14th century in 1910, Yi dynasty. By the way, my midterm exam and final exam will all allow open book. So you don't have to memorize all these particular year or history, but you should know at least where it is located so that you can use open book opportunity, okay? So, but at any rate, Mongol invasion happened the 13th century. Yi dynasty from 14th century to 1910 ruled. 1590s invasion of the Japanese under Hideyoshi, we call Imjin-Weran. Hideyoshi waged war against Korean Peninsula. Korea's pre-modern population growth rate was less than 0.5% per year. You can see table 1 and 2. From 14th century to 1910, Korea's population increased by 7 to 8 times. But the area of arable land increased by twofold or less. What does that mean? While population increased 7 to 8 times, if arable land increased by only twice, 2 times, twofold, then that much population density is higher. Therefore, agricultural food problem will surface because population grew 8 times. On the other hand, arable land by 2 times. That means the rest of the population will suffer from hunger. So 1918, the first Japanese land survey, according to this land survey, Koreans on the average had only about 0.12 hectare, about 1/3 of acre. Only Japan had less cultivated acreage per capita. So Japan had even less cultivated acreage per capita. So population density was severely higher in Japan than in Korea, and which is very interesting statistics. You can check population growth through table 3.1. Why the population growth is very important? From 1397 to 1917, annual rate of increase in population is estimated 0.055. China, similar period, increased by 0.3 to 0.36%. Japan 0.32%. That means at that time, population is not only crops demand, but also crops suppliers. In other words, during this time, people demand for food, but at the same time, people themselves are supplying food. The only production capacity is population. So if Korea's population annual rate of increase over this roughly 500 years is minus 0.55, on the other hand, China and Japan recorded 0.32%. That means China and Japan's production capacity increased sharply, but Korea's production supply capacity declined. It's only after Japanese colonial rule, Korea regained annual rate of increase in population. So this is population statistics is not only important for demand side, but also important for supply side. Population growth in Korea, 1939, 1397, 1972. And you can see the urbanization in pre-modern East Asia. For example, number of 100,000 people, percent of total population, last column, if you see, Korea was only 2.0, 1.5%, but China around 3 to 4%. Japan is higher. Japan was higher into 6.9%. What does that mean? Japanese urbanization rate was much higher than China, than Korea. Because that much Japan's development was fast and a lot of higher than Korea's. Okay. So let me stop here. Next week, let me begin with this slide number 10. Mr. Han, please remind me slide number 10. Again, as I said over chat message, next week I will be online lecturing from Ulaanbaatar. I hope internet connection causes no problem. So I will see all of you in Ulaanbaatar by internet connection. Okay. So let me start for today's lecture, and I would like to still receive any comments or questions if you have.
Everything fine. Thank you for the lecture.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption of the linking the files for sharing, file sharing. We made a mistake. We kept opening up the old version, but we wasted time about 10 to 15 minutes. Other than that, we have pretty much covered what we are supposed to cover. So farewell to all of you until next week, and I hope to see you by internet Zoom next week from Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. Thank you for your attention.